We've all heard stories of people seeing a Bigfoot-like creature from a distance, maybe just a quick glimpse in the woods. But some sightings are much scarier and more dangerous than just a brief look. Take, for example, the summer of 1924 at Mount St. Helens, in a narrow gorge on the eastern side of the mountain. This place is now called Ape Canyon. A group of gold miners came out of the woods, terrified and with wide eyes, claiming they saw 7-foot tall, ape-like animals that threw boulders at them. These miners said they were about 8 miles from Spirit Lake when they saw 4 of these giant creatures moving upright, like humans, through the forest. They described them as having long black hair, with ears about 4 inches long that stood straight up. The creatures had short, stubby toes and seemed to weigh around 400 pounds. When the miners saw these creatures, one of the men fired his rifle and hit one of them 3 times. The creature fell off a cliff. This turned out to be a big mistake. That night, while the men were sleeping in their cabin, they were woken up by huge stones hitting the outside of the cabin. They also heard giant bodies slamming against the walls and the door. The ape-like creatures were getting their revenge. Things got even worse when the creatures tore a hole in the roof and started throwing rocks into the cabin. One of the men was hit and knocked unconscious for almost 2 hours. It was a night full of terror. Finally, as the sun began to rise, the creatures stopped their attack and disappeared. In the morning, the men cautiously looked outside. When they saw it was safe, they quickly ran into the woods to escape. They made it to safety, with no one seriously hurt. They reported their scary encounter to forest rangers. The rangers went back to the cabin and then traveled down into the difficult-to-reach gorge to try to find the creature's body that the miners claimed they shot. Around the cabin, the rangers did find very large footprints, about 14 inches long. Some people say this was all just a hoax, but the men who experienced it swore it was real. Like most Bigfoot stories, we may never know the truth about what really happened in what is now called the Battle of Ape Canyon. I was working as a farmhand in 1981 in Manitoba, Canada. It was a normal night, or so I thought. I was in the oak shed when suddenly I heard a huge bang. It was so loud that it scared me to bits. I rushed outside to see what happened, only to find that all the horses had run off. As I stood there, trying to figure out what was going on, I heard some shuffling behind the shed. I cautiously looked back and saw a massive figure towering over me. It was a creature so big that its head and shoulders peeked over the shed's roof. I couldn't believe my eyes. The creature looked around and then fixed its gaze on me. It let out a deep growl that I could feel in my chest. In that moment, I was frozen with fear. I sprinted to the barn to get help from my colleague. Together, armed with pitchforks, we bravely went back outside. The creature was still there, looking around curiously. We screamed and shouted at it, and it leaned against the shed before running off into the night. Later, the farmer arrived with a shotgun, but the creature was long gone. At 3 a.m., we were awakened by the police. They informed us that the horses had escaped and caused quite a commotion. We found them terrified, and one officer mentioned seeing a tall, hairy figure jump over a fence. Slowly, strange occurrences started to make sense, from needing to order oats more frequently to odd behaviors of the horses. It seemed like something was spooking them. The pieces came together when we discovered a strange nest-like structure under a tarp in the hay bales. Bigfoot was living among us. We called in experts from the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, and they confirmed that our encounter was credible. It turned out that Bigfoot had a thing for oats, which explained why they were drawn to our farm. It was a wild and unbelievable experience, but it opened our eyes to a whole new world of possibilities. In 1893, former President Teddy Roosevelt wrote a memoir called The Wilderness Hunter. One of the most intriguing stories from this book tells of a strange encounter related by a weather-beaten old mountain man. This man recalled an experience from his youth when he and a friend went beaver trapping in a river valley in the Montana Territory. The story begins with the two men arriving in a remote mountain pass where some mining prospectors had previously discovered the half-eaten remains of a lone trapper. Undeterred by the grim warning, the two trappers set up camp at the foot of the pass. They then trekked out to set their beaver traps along the river. Upon returning to their campsite that evening, they discovered their lean-to destroyed and the contents of their bags scattered all over the ground. As they investigated, they noticed tracks that looked bear-like, yet something was off. They made a torch from their campfire and studied the tracks more closely. It appeared that the bear was walking on two legs, like a human. Although uneasy, they laughed off the idea of anything strange and settled in for the night. Hours later, they were jerked awake by an unpleasant stench and the shadow of a huge figure at the entrance of their lean-to. One of them fired his rifle, causing the beast to retreat into the forest. The next morning, anxious but determined, they checked their traps again and spent the day along the river. By evening, they returned to find their camp destroyed once more and saw those same unsettling footprints. That night, sleep was scarce. They lay alert, listening to the snapping of twigs and other loud noises outside. The oppressive sense of being watched made them decide they had enough. At dawn, they resolved to leave the valley while they still could. On their way back, the men opted to collect any catches from their traps. One trapper went to a nearby river alone. When he returned a few hours later, he stumbled upon a horrifying sight. His friend lay dead against a tree, his neck broken with 4 fang marks, and those same eerie footprints circled around. The surviving trapper barely took the time to process the scene. Overcome with fear, he fled the area immediately. Though he couldn't identify the creature, he described its awful stench and screaming, characteristics that align with what we now call Bigfoot. In February of 1829, the Okefenokee swamp in Georgia was a mysterious place. A group of settlers had just moved to the edge of the swamp. They began to hear stories from the local indigenous people about strange beings living on an island deep in the swamp. These beings were big and hairy, nothing anyone had ever seen before. One sunny day, 2 men and a child decided to explore the swamp. They pushed through the thick trees and walked on soggy ground, unaware of what they might find. After a while, they stumbled upon giant footprints in the mud. These prints were enormous, about 18 inches long and 9 inches wide. The men felt a chill go down their spine. They knew no human could have made these. Scared, they quickly turned around and made their way back home. As soon as they reached their village, they spread the word about the strange footprints. The tale of the giant tracks sparked the curiosity of a group of hunters who decided to seek out this mysterious creature. One of the original men agreed to guide the hunters back to the spot where they had found the prints. The hunters were determined and carried their weapons, ready for anything. They followed the tracks for days, deep into the heart of the swamp. At one point, they decided to discharge their weapons so they could clean and reload them. That night, as the hunters sat around their campfire, they heard strange noises, low growls, and heavy footsteps. Suddenly, a massive creature lunged from the darkness. The hunters fought back, firing their rifles, but the creature was fierce. It killed 5 of the men before finally falling to their bullets. When the dust settled, the remaining hunters measured the beast. It was 13 feet tall and covered in rough, coarse hair. Fearing that more creatures might come, the 2 surviving men decided to run for their lives. They left behind the body of the Bigfoot and the fallen hunters, their hearts pounding with fear. They ran through the swamp as fast as they could, not stopping until they were safely back at their village. The next day, a larger group of villagers went back to the swamp to look for the bodies, but when they reached the spot, everything was gone. There were no signs of the dead men or the giant creature. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Many people found the story hard to believe. Were the men attacked by alligators, or was there foul play involved? Or perhaps, as some suggested, there was a small group of Bigfoot-like creatures living on the island in the middle of the swamp. Maybe they went extinct or moved away. No one knows for sure. To this day, the mystery remains unsolved. The tale of the Okefenokee Bigfoot is a strange and eerie story from a time long ago, leaving many to wonder about the secrets hidden in the depths of the swamp.